action. I can't get no call to action, but I try, and I try, and I try, and I try.
Hello and welcome to Call to Action, the go-to podcast for anyone trying to make sense of the world of marketing, advertising and beyond. In an industry that is a minefield of utter bollocks, we aim to capture our heroes and allies from the front line to have a chinwag with. It's like Pokemon Go, with the single but vital exception that it's not a short-term bandwagon of shite. It's brought to you by Gasp, and I'm Giles Edwards, co-founder and MD. Today, I've caught Phil Barden. One of the most brilliant minds in marketing, Phil spent 25 years client-side at the likes of Unilever, Diageo and T-Mobile, before taking the mantle of MD at decision science consultancy DECODE. Pioneers and world leaders in this fascinating new field. Phil is also the author of Decoded, the science behind why we buy, which delves deep into decision science and is one of the most important and enlightening books on marketing to be published in recent years, being heaped with praise from the likes of previous guest, the brilliant Rory Sutherland. Phil says, decision science offers a way for marketers to step into the boardroom and leave la-la land behind. Welcome to the show, Phil.
Thanks very much, Giles. Pleased to be here.
Right, 7 quick-fire questions. Mac or PC?
Oh, I'd love to say Mac, but I'm afraid I've been brought up on PC, and I've never had the time to make the switch.
There's a real sound of guilt there.
I know. Well, it's you get all these Mac evangelists, and once you've tried Mac, you never go back. And I'm so tempted. I've got an iPhone and I've got an iPad, but my bulk of my work is still PC based, I'm afraid.
Okay, so it's not completely binary then.
No.
Book or Facebook?
Oh, book, always.
McVitie's or Jacobs?
McVitie's. I did a student placement with United Biscuits, and I have fond memories of eating Jaffa Cakes straight off the production line.
Get them while they're fresh.
Absolutely right.
Right, famous Phils. Phil Collins or Phil Mitchell?
Phil Collins. I grew up loving Genesis and became a fan of Phil Collins.
System 1 or System 2?
Neither, and you can't choose between the two because they're not binary, so I'll have to say both.
Perfect. Richard Shotton or Rory Sutherland?
Oh, that's unfair.
It is unfair.
I love them both. They're brilliant. They're both brilliant guys. I respect both of them. I guess it depends whether, what you're talking about, dinner party conversation or sort of who you'd want on a five-a-side team, or I've no idea what the context is.
Oh, let's go five-a-side team.
I think, again, difficult to choose. I think Richard might be a little bit more nimble around the pitch.
That's fair. Okay, finally then, client side or agency side?
I have to say agency side. Now I've experienced both. I grew up and spent 25 years client side. But now working for myself in a small business, I relish that autonomy. And don't miss sort of bureaucracy and hierarchy and politics.
Okay, good answer. I'm sure it's there if you look close enough in agency life, but you've managed to avoid it, which is something to celebrate. Yeah,
I think a lot of it's to do with the size of the organisation and sort of decision making modus. So I've been fortunate, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. Good stuff. So Phil, what was your first ever job, and then what was your first marketing job?
My first ever job was a Saturday job, actually, at a chain of stores which is long gone, called McFisheries. As the name suggests, they sold fish, spooky that, and they also sold fruit and vegetables. So it was a weird one because all my mates were getting Saturday jobs in sort of trendy places like clothing and jeans and whatever. And I was dealing with cold wet fish. But the upside was that I got paid much more than they did. So that then when you had your Saturday earnings to go out and blow on a Saturday night, I had a lot more money in my pocket.
Yeah. Okay. Did you enjoy the job?
I did. It was there were some great characters there, and I enjoyed working with customers. Actually, it was my first sort of experience of customer service, but it was hard work, and some of it sort of deeply unpleasant in the sense that the Saturday boys had to do all the weekly deep cleaning, and that wasn't particularly nice. But yeah, it was a great experience.
Presumably a few years later, you had your first experience in marketing.
Yeah. So I did a thin sandwich course, a business studies course, and I was sponsored by United Biscuits, and that involved 3 6-month placements. So I spent 6 months in a biscuit factory, and then 6 months on the road selling vitties, and then 6 months in the marketing department. And I had a friend at school who was always destined to go into advertising, and he did, and became a very great copywriter and creative director. And he sort of got me interested in this whole creative industry. And then when I had my 6-month placement, that really cemented for me that I just loved the whole process of finding out what people wanted, and then making something tangible to deliver against those needs. I absolutely loved it. And then after graduation, I then rejoined the company briefly in a marketing role.
Oh, okay. And so what did you graduate in?
In business studies, where I specialised in, I'm focused on marketing. So I did my thesis in marketing, and yeah.
Oh, so it was a very logical route then into marketing.
Yeah, I think so. And I liked it because one of the things I liked was no 2 days were the same. It was, the scope was wide ranging, and I think this is possibly something that has changed over time, because I see so much now written about our industry where marketing equals communication, and that's about it. Whereas and maybe it's a company I was fortunate to work with, certainly United Biscuits, but then I've quickly thereafter joined Unilever, and Unilever really took this idea, I think, as Procter did, where the brand manager was effectively managing director of the brand. So you were like the hub in a wheel, and you were profit accountable, and that meant you had to have fingers in lots of different pies, and really be responsible for the 4, 5, or 6 Ps, depending on how you define it, and ultimately delivering the bottom line. So communications was, of course, part of that, but it wasn't all of it. You had to really understand your brand, whether it's a physical product, in my case, and in my experience, and its packaging, and its evolution, the innovation strategy. And then, of course, working with all the sales guys as well, and how do we best promote this? How do we look at occasions? I mean, we were talking about stuff in those days that now people seem to discover. Every year you hear a new term come up. You think, well, that's just what we were doing. Influencers. Well, we were doing that 20, 30 years ago. We just didn't call it that. And of course, we didn't have the channels in those days, pre-internet, believe it or not, back in the dark ages. But we were doing the same principles. So so that was my first sort of proper job, and the more I got into it, the more I found it incredibly rewarding.
Yeah, well, it's great. You made a few really great points just now, but one of them that really stood out for me was how, and Mark Ritson calls it the communification of marketing, where people do become either too obsessed or simply aren't aware that marketing is more than comms, which, of course, as you've said, and it sounds like a wonderful role to have stepped into relatively early on in your career, by being given the responsibility of becoming the managing director of a particular brand. You're immediately aware of the whole range of responsibilities that role demands.
Absolutely, and the important thing as well is understanding the knock-on implications and impacts of a decision in one area, and that it will feed through to other areas, or what you do in one area you have to extend to other, let's say, touch points. So everything has to be aligned, everything has to be consistent, and unbeknown to me at the time, it just kind of made intuitive sense that, what you say what you see and you see what you say, and this sort of stuff, and that, the pack design had to fit with the brand essence and the brand proposition, and your communications had to. And that sounds obvious, but if you divorce those two activities, you're not going to get alignment, and you're going to get some sort of gap opening up between strategy and execution. And what I've learned since then, in terms of how the brain works and how associations are built, memory structures and neural networks are built on the basis of what fires together wires together. And the more consistent you are and persistent you are, the stronger the neural networks and the faster the associations. And that's where you get mental availability. That's the first brand that comes to mind in a particular context. But that is built on a foundation of learning. And if you're chopping and changing and doing something and your packaging that doesn't fit consistently with your communications, for example, then you're weakening those memory structures. One of the most important lessons I think I ever learned, and at the time, again, it kind of felt right, but I didn't know precisely why, was I was brand manager on Oxo in Unilever, and I was invited out for lunch by the JWT account planning director, and I thought, this is nice, agency lunch, sort of right the afternoon off. And she sat me down and we dispensed with the pleasantries, and then she looked me straight in the eye and she said, listen, Phil, I've worked on this brand a lot longer than you, and I'll be around working on this brand long after you've moved on. So my strong advice to you is don't fuck it up. And I was quite taken aback. I thought, hang on, I'm the client. You can't talk to me like that. But yeah, she went on to explain, and that actually has stuck with me for years and years, and was probably one of the single most important bits of advice I ever received as a brand manager, because often it's a lot smarter and a lot braver not to change strategy when you move on to a brand. Human nature dictates that we want to make our mark, and typical new brand manager, and whatever the average tenure in a job is now, it's shortening, I think, over time.
Yeah, it's quite alarming.
He or she wants to make their mark, and that normally means a relaunch, a repositioning, new comm strategy or whatever. And it might actually be the worst thing you can do for a brand, because you're playing with those memory structures. It doesn't mean you need to keep things the same, 100% the same forevermore, and you can't change stuff. And there are lots of good examples, and I give an example in my book about links or acts in other countries where they have refreshed the communications at a signal level. So the actual communication is different when they launch a new variant or a new fragrance, or they move into a different product category. But the meaning of those signals has remained constant ever since links and acts were launched. And that's what I mean about consistency and persistency. It's a sort of fresh create, being consistently creative and creatively consistent and all of that. But it's a very, very important point, because that's how the brain learns. And ultimately we want people to make our brand the brand of choice. And you're not going to do that if you've weakened or destroyed or changed memory structures.
No, well, I think that lady at JWT sounds fantastic. I mean, she delivered the advice quite bluntly, but clearly it was very sound advice.
Yes.
And you're right, people do have that, it must be like a human, like an inherent want to make their mark, which is understandable. That doesn't necessarily mean between any kind of visual or otherwise change to codes, your brand codes and your signals.
Yeah, exactly.
How much do you think your career was benefited from your time with United Biscuits, literally being on the road and selling and having that exposure to the factory and everything in its entirety?
I think my marketing career benefited enormously, because that experience made those areas of the business tangible to me. If I hadn't been there, if I hadn't had to drive around Southall selling cases of cheddars to independent grocers, and all I'd done was gone from college into marketing and then tried to think about promotions and sales aids and point of sale for those channels. I wouldn't have any concept of what the reality on the ground is like. And similarly in production, you're learning and understanding the constraints under which they operate, and how to do things and how not to do things helped enormously. So if I wanted to make a change to packaging or introduce a short run of promotional packaging or something, I would be able to empathize and understand the implications. And it helps also, of course, building some personal relationships, because then they know you. You're not just this sort of Johnny Nobody who's popped up in head office and is trying to dictate and tell you what to do. This is someone who's actually spent 6 months, mixing dough and packing biscuits and shifting pallets and stuff, and has not a perfect handle, but has a better handle on the realities of business than someone who just comes fresh out of college. So I think it really did help.
Yeah, I was hoping you'd say that, and half expecting you to as well, simply for that visibility of that whole lifespan of how something is produced, and understanding the different channels and understanding sales. You make the point yourself, we can come on to later, about often when researching, focus groups often don't know the answer because of the context you're asking them in is so different to the context of, say, shopping. So a packaging redesign, as you mentioned in your answer then, is only really understood in the context of where that packaging appears.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the key reasons I got into the whole decision and behavioral science area, was because I'd always been innately curious about why people did things from a marketing point of view. Why would they buy a brand or not buy a brand? And had to rely on the, let's call them, traditional techniques as they were understood 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So typically qualitative and then quantitative, but often frustrated that what people said versus what they actually did were very different things. And that goes for quant research as well. I remember seeing a meta study by TNS at the time. One of their guys had looked at thousands of quant studies they'd done on purchase consideration, and then went on to look at actual purchase behavior. And I think he found a correlation of something like 0.27 between stated purchase intent and actual purchase behavior, which is woefully low. And we've had this thing for years about 80 to 90% of new products fail in their first couple of years after launch. And you think, well, why is that? Because I would bet the vast majority of those products are researched and people have said they would buy them. So why is there this gap? And in Decoded, I look at the example of the Tropicana orange juice redesign, where the new design met all of the actual standards they had, which were that the new design had to be fresher than the original. It had to be a cleaner design, cleaner looking design than the original, and more modern than the original. And when you judge it against those criteria, it absolutely wins. But then they put it on shelf and no one could find it. And people have seen that Tropicana was out of stock. And you think, well, there's something missing here. It's either they're asking the wrong questions in terms of the what, the content, or the way that they're doing the research, the how is suboptimal. So what could it be? And I really had my eyes open when in my last role at T-Mobile, I'd commissioned research around Europe, very expensive, very time consuming, and it was giving me frustrating answers. And when I discussed the results with some of the local countries, they were scratching their heads as well and saying this just kind of doesn't feel right. And someone introduced me to DECODE, so that the company I now work with, and DECODE was founded about 13 years ago in Germany by a neuroscientist and a psychologist. And I got them in and gave them some little sort of tests, if you like, some tasks. Tell me about this ad. Why do you think this ad would work or not work? And they just told me there and then. We came up with very plausible sounding reasons, which I'd never heard before. I'd never heard the sort of angle that they had, and I commissioned them on a small piece of work, and that came back making perfect sense. And it was almost like, for me, it was like pieces in the jigsaw were falling into place and completing the picture. And they just, the more I worked with them, and the T-Mobile relaunch was based on the foundational principles that they used about what motivates human behavior. And the results took us all by surprise. I mean, the flash mob dance ad at London's Liverpool Street Station, which is 10 years old now, but 41 million YouTube views is more than any John Lewis Christmas ad.
Just putting it out there.
Just put it out there. Just say it. But just for context, right? Because it's John Lewis Christmas advertising is famous and it's rightly lauded. But this ad was pretty powerful. The one ad, flash mob dance, as we called it, increased sales by 49%. I mean, it went out on a centre break of Big Brother on a Friday night, and that weekend, footfall into T-Mobile stores doubled, according to the traffic monitors on the store doors. And we had never seen, I had certainly never seen a sort of cause and effect as powerful as that. And when I talked to the DECODE guys, I said, this is amazing. Everybody's stunned by the results. They looked puzzled and said, well, why are you stunned? Because we deliberately built motivators of behavior into the brief, and that's what that ad is signaling. So why are you surprised it's effective? And I thought, wow, this is interesting. This is something I have never, ever heard before. And so the more I chatted to these guys, and they pointed me in the direction of some more of the sort of pop psychology books. So Dan Ariely and Jonah Lehrer, Predictably Irrational and How We Decide, stuff like that. This was pre Kahneman's book, and a few light touch academic papers, which, if you're not familiar with them, are tortuous to read because they're just written in a very obscure language. But some of the lighter ones, and the more I read, the more I thought, this is fundamental to marketing. This is about consumer behavior and behavior change, and ultimately marketing's about behavior change. We want people to buy our brand, buy more of our brand, talk about our brand, whatever. It's about behavior change. So why doesn't the commercial world know about this? And when I talk to these guys, I'd say, this stuff's amazing. How do you know all this stuff? And they said, well, how come you don't know all this stuff? Because this is what science has been studying for the last several decades, and whether it's neuroscience or cognitive psychology or social psychology, and the more sort of cultural anthropological areas, semiotics, behavioral economics, there are things to learn from all of them. And when you put them together, which is what we do, is what we call decision science, is sort of amalgam of these different fields. I think you get a better understanding of why people do what they do and how to change that.
Yeah, it's to me, it's just quite bewildering that there's even a debate about whether of how big the overlap is into marketing, because it's not even an overlap, it's at its core. And we've been fortunate enough to welcome both Richard Shotton and Rory Sutherland onto the podcast, and I think I've made the same point to them. You only have to look at basic human behavioural principles, and sometimes they might sound quite trivial. So one I know Rory likes to give is how in Italy you don't accrue driving points. You start with 10 and they get taken away every time you commit a driving offence because of the power of loss aversion. And so small examples like that do sound quite trivial and silly, but there's so much. You only have to read The Choice Factory for, I think it's 25 in Richard's book, which is so easy to apply. And obviously your own book, Decoded. So to me, it's just so obvious because we're dealing with human beings.
Absolutely. And I think, part of the problem is in terms of gaining wider acceptance is that, and I count myself amongst this because I experienced the same feeling. You grow up with a certain mental model and a certain worldview and paradigm for how communication works, for example, or why people do what they do. And often that is received wisdom, because that's, it's the way we've always done things around here in certain organizations. Or it's in ad agencies as well, because they have a view of how communication works. It's the research companies as well, who of course have a vested interest in their own commercial models and not wanting to change those. But also we are victims of our own of these very same biases. So there is a bias called the Semmelweis reflex, which is the propensity to reject new information if it contradicts our existing beliefs or paradigms. And we have the status quo bias, and we default back to what we know because it's familiar, and that means it's safe. And anything unfamiliar, any change has two implications. One, it's risky, and ultimately that's all about survival, whether it's within a job or and ultimately as a human being. So survival is a pretty strong motivator. And the other thing is it's very effortful. It's mentally taxing to stop going with the flow using system one, because that's what we've always done. So it's fluent and it's cognitive ease. And engage system two, because that's tiring. It burns a lot of energy, and it's about learning something new. It's a bit like why I haven't switched over to a Mac wholeheartedly, because it's difficult.
Yeah, there's friction there, isn't there?
Yeah, exactly. Having spent so many years on a PC, it will take me time and be very effortful to learn a new way. And that's the same with changing your view of human behavior. If I've got a mental model for how marketing works or communications work, then if you're expecting me to change that, then I've got these inbuilt biases to kind of prevent that happening. So that, I think, that's behind why the adoption and acceptance of behavioral science, decision science, is not more widespread.
So you've probably answered this already. I was going to ask if there was a key moment that prompted your shift to decision science and your interest in decision science, but clearly the work you did with T-Mobile and Decode agency must have been the significant moment.
Yeah, it absolutely was. And it was, the more I talked to the guys from Decode, and they'd come from, one had done postdoctoral research in neuroscience. The other was a cognitive psychologist. So they had a lot of experience from science and academia, but what they'd managed to do, which is quite rare, I think, is to make the transition to the commercial world and apply their knowledge to commercial business questions. So any question I asked them, they could answer. And I'd never ever experienced that. They had a different way of looking at things and explaining things. So the role of context, for example, I'd never even thought about that. And coming back to your point about packaging, as a brand manager, I had looked at pack designs on my desk or on a designer's Mac in isolation, and we debated all the nuances and little tweaks and changes and whatever. And one of the first things that the Decode guys said was, well, firstly, there's change blindness. So if you only make subtle tweaks, they probably won't even be noticed anyway. But more importantly, you have to view the pack in the context in which it's going to be bought. There's no point looking at it on your desk, because no one buys it off your desk. And it sounds so obvious, but you'd be amazed at the number of people who don't do that. Those shelf tests or physical or virtual stores or whatever, just to see how the thing performs. Is it perceptible in peripheral vision? I didn't even realize that the vast majority of our vision is blurred and loses color saturation. So only 2 degrees is pin sharp. And so if you're pushing a trolley down a supermarket aisle, or even when you're online and you're looking at a screen, the things at the edge of the screen are going to be blurred and lack color compared to your foveal vision, the 2 degrees. So just doing something simple like blurring an image to see if what I've changed is still perceptible. You'll see in Decoded, I've done that with the old and the new Tropicana packs, and it's very clear when you blur them, you just don't get that the new one is Tropicana any longer, because they've dropped the distinctive assets such as the orange and the curved green logo, which are still perceptible under peripheral vision. So if I'm pushing a trolley down the chiller aisle, I still get that there's Tropicana to the left or the right of me. But with the new packet, it just doesn't even get into the brain. So stuff like this, which sounds so simple, but few people do it. And I just was completely unaware of it until these guys told me about it.
It does sound so simple, and I'm not surprised at all how few people do it, because it's a point that we constantly make here, and I find myself making it frequently. If we're designing something for social, then view it in the same context, so look at it within that social media's app. Too often people are reviewing work, whether it's screen-based or whether it's a print ad or whatever, as if it was being suspended in an art gallery and everyone was going to crowd around looking at it. But they're not. And that goes for everything. That goes to the copy, goes to absolutely everything that makes up the content of the piece of comms. But often we sweat over the copy as if everyone's going to sit down and read it word for word.
Yeah, absolutely. And and if again, understanding things like perceptual hierarchy, if we have a visual that has a human being in it, there's greater than 80% probability that another human being will fixate on that human in the visual within the first couple of eye movements. There's nothing more rewarding to the brain than another human being. And so you can have the most beautifully crafted copy, but if you've got a person in there, the viewer won't even necessarily look at the copy.
Yeah, well, your the Tropicana example in the book is wonderful, and the other point, which is obviously worth making on that, is it takes time and it takes resource and serious investment to get that familiarity of your distinctive assets or brand codes, whatever you want to call them, in the consumer's head. So brands that alter those or play with them too much can do so much damage, often without intent.
Oh, totally. And no one, no brand manager does a redesign like that with the intention of losing $27 million in sales, for sure. But you're absolutely right. I think it is just naivety and ignorance in the positive sense of simply being unaware of this sort of principle. Because you're absolutely right. If I have distinctive assets, why would I lose them? Why would I want to change them? We have a study which we call iconic assets testing, which does exactly that, to identify quantitatively using a System 1 type test what a brand's distinctive assets are and those of competitors. And one of the most interesting phrases that a client said to me was, "We're about to write a brief for a redesign, and we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but to be honest with you, we don't know which is which." And that was great to hear, because that's exactly where you need to be in that state of unknowing before you write a design rebrief, because otherwise it's about subjective opinion and liking, and you just have debates internally and with your agencies about, well, I think this or I like that, and this is not absolutely it's absolute quicksand for a brand, because it's not about subjective opinion here. It's about objective fact. There will be, like the orange on Tropicana, it is a distinctive asset. Then, having identified that, then you have a strategic choice. Do I keep it and exploit it or not? Or how do I treat it? But at least you're starting from that position of knowledge.
Yeah, and equally, it doesn't matter at all, or if someone likes your distinctive asset, if it's distinctive and you associate it correctly with my brand, job done.
Absolutely, yeah. And as long as it also conveys the correct semantic meaning, if it's a color or a shape or whatever, it will have a meaning. When the brain when it perceives an object, then the brain does two things simultaneously. It metaphorically asks the question, what is it? But also, what does it mean? What does it represent? And it searches associative memory for pattern matching. So, if I have a certain color, then and that color is strongly associated with a brand, then not only will the brand be activated, but also the meaning of that color will be activated simultaneously. So it's important to understand, particularly when you're developing new assets, that you want to become iconic in the future. It's very important to understand that meaning, because that's culturally learned, that's culturally embedded, and you can't change that stuff easily. I mean, it changes as fast as culture evolves, basically.
So Decode. Let's talk. I mean, we've obviously dipped in and out of the book already, but 4 years after the wonderful and hugely successful T-Mobile flash mob, you published Decoded. Was that something you had always intended or planned on publishing a book and authoring a book, or were you just so compelled to put this all down in print and release it? We've spoken to lots of authors on the pod, and it's always really interesting to understand how it happened.
Yeah, I think it was really, I think, a way to codify my own journey through this, and what I felt was missing in the market, and of course, a book is important because it creates a frame for me as an author. It also helps, with business commercially. It's a sales tool as well as being something that people, of course, hopefully find useful. But I think the real reason for it was me wanting to find a way to spread more efficiently what I'd learned, because up to that point it was a question of either rocking up at conferences and doing a 30-45 minute presentation, or knocking on doors and trying to do that. But actually having a book then gets your message out to far more people. So that was really the genesis of it, of wanting to get my learnings codified and out to more people. And I was very keen to do it in a way that a brand manager or an agency manager would understand. So I don't have a PhD in neuroscience or psychology, and in many ways that's an advantage, because what I hope I've been able to do is sort of translate from those fields and those worlds into what the application and the implication is for business. And with the sort of checklists at the end of each chapter, there's some easy ways to bring the principles to life. And ultimately that's what it's all about. It's about helping people become more effective, more efficient in what they do. So that was really the genesis of it.
Yeah, and also it put you in an advantage to better articulate it to the vast majority of your readers, who also wouldn't have had a psychology related degree.
Yes, indeed, that's absolutely right. Yeah.
There's so much in the book we could talk about, and we don't want to give it all away. But another area which I love is where you talk about the just pricing and frames of reference being significant in someone's perception of something seeming expensive or cheap. The idea that it's not a binary thing; it's only expensive or cheap relative to something else.
Yeah. Well, perception is always relative. It's never absolute. And the whole sort of Nespresso concept is interesting in itself, because if you compare the price of Nespresso capsules to a jar of coffee on the shelf, they're ridiculously expensive in terms of the number of cups of coffee you get. So you'd never buy it. And if that was the context in which you researched it, I would think you get a lot of people talking very negatively about Nespresso. Now, yes, it might be great quality, but there's no way I'm going to pay that when I can buy a jar of X. But if you reframe it and change the context to, so how much does your coffee cost you at Starbucks or Cafe Nero or Costa or wherever, then suddenly Nespresso looks incredibly good value, and for a comparable cup of coffee for a very good quality. Now, obviously, the context is different because you don't have the physical location of a Starbucks or whatever. That's true. But to get a barista style and quality cup of coffee in your home for a fraction of that price suddenly changes the game. And we're always doing this. If I show you a picture of a circle and ask you, is it a big or small circle? You can't answer unless it's next to another circle, and if that's bigger or smaller. So that's what the brain is doing all the time. Always this, everything being relative.
Yeah, fantastic. I quoted you in the intro suggesting that marketers are, well, it's probably unfair to say that marketers are in La La Land, but you at least suggested that this area of study is a route back into the boardroom. How do you think so many marketers did end up in La La Land? Do you think it was primarily down to the point we made and discussed earlier about being too comms focused and not more business oriented?
I think that is true, because what has always been difficult to prove, and this is where the work of Bennett and Field is very helpful, I think, looking at the sort of short and long term measures. What's always been difficult to prove without the luxury of econometric models is the impact of marketing activities on the bottom line, which a lot of the board are driven by return on investment, and I can do that for an investment in a bit of capital equipment in a factory, or I can do that if I invest in expanding my sales force or whatever it might be. But to do that for a bit of comms is a lot more difficult and involves a lot more assumptions. So I think that's part of the reason. I think there's another reason, which is that as marketeers, we always seem to be seduced by the shiny new thing. This the dog that barks at every passing car, and looking at short-term stuff. I think that hasn't helped either. But if you only need to go look at any marketing social media or any of the conferences that are around or the marketing publications, and you'd think we're doomed. Everything's changed, nothing's the same, this blah blah blah, and there's this sort of anxiety to always keep up. Whether it's fear of missing out or just I need to get all over our influencer strategy because everybody else is. So it's sort of the social norming bias, if you like, at play. And I think we only have capacity to do a certain finite amount of things in terms of time and investment. And I think the combination of those has led to marketeers just neglecting the basics. And whenever I talk to clients, I always try and bring it back by asking, well, why are people doing that, and what is the behaviour you're trying to change? Not going downstream in terms of what's our TikTok strategy or whatever it might be. It's like, come back upstream, guys, because there's a behaviour change issue here you need to define first. And that's what I would certainly urge marketeers to try and get back to those basic tenets and basic principles of behaviour.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's strategy before tactics, isn't it? It would be so refreshing. Maybe we should do it. Take out a stand at one of the big marketing conferences and just have a big banner saying the principles haven't changed one bit.
Yeah, well, Bill Bernbach had this lovely quotation about it being fashionable to talk about changing man, whereas what we should focus on is unchanging man. Because it's true, all this complete bollocks about how generations are different one from the other. Well, I think Mark Ritson has done a great job at debunking that, as have many others. But it's a fact that we are still driven by the same motivations as our ancestors, and we will continue to be driven by those motivations. So guess what? Why don't you spend a bit of time understanding what those are first, and then how that plays out in your category, with your brand, etc., before just leaping onto the, oh my God, we need to do something different.
Yeah, we're huge fans here of Stephen King's JWT planning guide, which I think he originally penned in the early 60s.
Yeah.
Which would probably blow the mind of any social media agency out there listening.
I think it would if they were even aware who Stephen King was. And I think there's also, compounding this whole effect is the sort of ageism particularly in agency world. And if someone said, well, look, here's this amazing document, I think the initial reaction would be, well, that's 40 years old or whatever. What's that got to do with today? Where does it say digital in there? And people lose sight of the fact that actually there's some enduring principles, and a lot of these very smart guys, Stephen King, Paul Feldwick is another very, very smart planning guys. Mark Earls as well, I would count in there, have really nailed some of these principles, and they've done it because they're bright guys. They've got a lot of experience, and they've read around the subject. They've taken time out to understand what's been studied, and that's the whole thing behind behavioural science as well. What is known already. You don't need to reinvent this stuff. It's already there. You just need to tap into it. But treating the outputs of things like Stephen King's paper as, well, actually, there could be some gold dust in here, rather than a knee-jerk reaction of, well, it's 40 years old, so we ignore it.
Yeah, absolutely right. Absolutely right. How do we get research right then? Because you mentioned about the focus groups in the Tropicana example. Is there a right approach to marketing? You touch on that again in the book, and I know you're a fan of the right type, but presumably it's a mix.
Yeah, it always is. It's never either or. And again, the answer here, as I've found, is to turn to science and academia, because if you look at the way that these guys and ladies approach issues, they might generate a hypothesis, then they will seek a method that is valid to measure or test the hypothesis. And that's exactly what we should be doing. So, for example, if we want to understand advertising, we want to look at advertising comprehension. Okay, so the task is, what did the viewer take out of that piece of advertising? That, as a task, is a reflective mental process. Reflective mental process is our system 2, and therefore it is perfectly valid to ask explicit questions or open-ended questions or whatever. So you come back upstream and say, what's the task, and therefore what mental processes are engaged, therefore what method should I use, and that will always see you right. Conversely, if you want to look at, let's say, emotional response, that is an automatic reflexive mental process, which is system 1. So you need to employ a method that is valid accordingly. So that's the way to look, always the way to look at it. I think with focus groups in particular, you do have the issues of context and social bias and respondent bias, self-reporting, all of that. But if you've got a smart moderator, particularly if they've been trained in techniques that will take all of these biases into account. We've got a couple of people on our team who are trained in something called morphological research, which I don't begin to understand, but is a way of getting around the system 2 sort of gatekeeper effect, being a policeman on what we self-report. So you can get more to the reflex system 1, then it can be a valid research method. But again, it comes back to what are you using it for? Is it generative? We often use it in a generative state to elicit language and phraseology that we then use in quantitative testing. So it's great for that purpose. Or are you actually using it as a gatekeeper itself, to pick a winner out of pack design or whatever it might be? And then I think you need to be careful, because again, it's the context thing. I don't decide on what pack I'm going to buy in front of 5 strangers in a room in Watford one evening. It's there's lots that can get in the way of the true response.
Yeah, and I also think so Henry Ford said, if I'd asked people what they wanted, they'd have said a faster horse. I think we need to leave a bit of space as well, don't you, for innovation or for just magic, or Rory Sutherland might call that luck.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely right. And and Apple's a very good example of that as well. Bringing out the iPod. Well, Sony Walkman was there already, and so you might argue, and I'm sure if it had been researched, people would have said, well, why do I need this thing? But then with a proposition of 1,000 songs or 10,000 songs in your pocket, suddenly you reframe it, and yeah, they've got design excellence as well, of course. That ergonomically and aesthetically, they are incredible products. So yeah, I think as you say, people don't know what they don't want, or what they want when it doesn't exist, when it's completely new to world. So yes, there has to be some space for that complete white space work.
Yeah, I'm doing my second mini MBA with Mark Ritson at the moment, and in brand management, and he keeps reminding all of the students to do a little prayer for imperfection,
Right.
Just to remind us. I think he does it just to reduce the anxiety in the classroom, to be honest. But it's just to remind us all that nothing is ever perfect. So, and that is valid for everything. So even just a bit of research is likely to be infinitely better than no research. Yeah. You don't have to, it's so easy, and I'm guilty of it, certainly, of worrying so much about something being perfect, but allowing that space for a bit of luck or just imperfection, as Mark said, is important too. I'd like to ask you a couple of listener questions.
Yeah.
So asking the general public for their opinion, be it on Brexit or boat names, is notoriously fraught with danger, but that's not stopped us asking. So we've selected two as usual, starting with Maria. Maria asks, is there anything fundamentally different in your decision science approach at DECODE, depending on whether a client is B2C or B2B?
Oh, that's a really interesting one. And the answer is yes, but not for an obvious reason. The obvious thinking that I've experienced is people always say, well, B2B is totally different from B2C. And you have to remember, of course, that people don't swap brains, right? They don't put a B2B brain in when they go to work. It's still the same brain that they have as a consumer and as someone who experiences communications when they're sat on the sofa in the evening or on their phone or device or whatever it might be. So the brain is the same. The principles by which it operates are identical, B2B or B2C. There's no difference. What can and often does show up as key differences are the goals that drive the individual. So in a B2B context, the goals tend to be more around what we call discipline and security. So it's the old thing about no one ever got fired for buying IBM. A B2B buyer needs precision, they need control, they need logic, they need efficiency, functionality, they need protection and reassurance in a way that B2C customers don't necessarily. So there are different goals, and also you have to realize that B2C customers are not sort of driven by KPIs either, which a B2B customer is. So when you're marketing to them, it's important to understand how the B2B buyer is being measured internally, and that can of course change your communications. So I think it's the real fundamental bit, because the real fundamental bit in what I've learned about behavioral science is that we are goal directed in our behavior. Our motivation is driven to achieve certain goals, and where a B2C customer might be driven, for example, by something that's about excitement or novelty or curiosity or change, a B2B buyer, that may be anathema to them. They may be in a psychologically very different space because they might need security and regularity and control, which is the opposite of change and excitement and variety, if you like. So understanding those goals is fundamental to looking at the difference between B2B and B2C.
Question 2 is from Colin, and Colin says, I saw on your Twitter that you reference via the work of Lisa Feldman Barrett that ideas in neuropsychology like nature or nurture and facial coding are dead. I was quite surprised but grateful for this insight. Are there any other common misconceptions and things that are just plain wrong in this field?
Oh, interesting one. So just to expand on Colin's question, I retweeted a tweet from Lisa Feldman Barrett. She is a neuroscientist, a neuropsychologist, an academic who has published, in our view, a great book called How Emotions Are Made. And the piece that she wrote was about killing zombies in October, as it's coming up to Halloween. And she said there are a lot of zombies in neuropsychology, and she cited a few. And one of them was the nature versus nurture approach. And what she says is it's not binary in the same way we talk about emotional or rational. It's never binary. There's evidence that it's a combination. So she was saying, if people talk about is it nature or nurture, you should say, well, it's both. It's neither one nor only the other. It's both. Facial coding is another one. I mean, she has recently published a meta study that she did, I think, with about 5 other scientists and academics looking at facial coding, which is founded on the so-called universal theory of 6 or 8 emotions being manifested in certain facial expressions. And she's basically debunked that totally. And this meta study fundamentally challenges it, because they are firstly, the way that emotion is expressed is not universal, and secondly, a certain facial expression can mean many different emotions as well. So she's fundamentally challenged that. Are there other ones? Yeah, I think my favorite bugbear is the emotional versus rational, because this has existed for so long in our industry, and it's unhelpful. But not only is it a false dichotomy, because response, communication, behaviour, whatever you want to call it, is neither. It's not binary. It's neither one nor the other, and it's unhelpful because it's driven people to thinking they have to make a choice. So we often hear, well, we need a product ad and we also need a brand ad. Because the product ad is the rational bit and the brand ad is the emotional bit. Well, that's an interesting mental split and model, but it's ridiculous, because even if you take something like Cillit Bang, Barry Scott, the Cillit Bang spokesperson, appears on screen with a real garish, in-your-face, bang, 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 tick marks coming up, no lime scale, no scum, eradicates this, that, and the other. And you could almost see the brief being written about, this is about product efficacy. Here are the reasons to believe, and everyone would say, well, it's a very rational ad. But if you think about the neuropsychological goals that are activated by that ad, you could say it gives people a sense of control and mastery over, the problem in whatever it is you're cleaning. You get a sense of self-esteem, pride as well. You can't tell me that self-esteem and pride aren't emotions or feelings that are evoked by this. Protection and reassurance as well. If I think I've got dirty surfaces in my home and there might be germs or whatever, and I eradicate them with this product, then it gives me a sense of protection, security, reassurance, maybe caring for others if I'm a caregiver. Those are all incredibly emotional responses to a apparently rational only ad. So it's neither one nor the other. It's always a combination of both, and that I think would help people understand how communication can work better.
Yeah, I mean, our industry in general is full of so many false binaries. It's something that Murray Calder discussed on his episode.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing is that people seem to have extrapolated emotional versus rational as system 1 versus system 2 as well. And I think my hypothesis for that is people have done that because we are victims of our own system 1, because system 1 jumps to plausible conclusions, and we've kind of already got these mental pigeonholes of emotional versus rational. But the true distinction is automatic versus controlled mental processes. So, when you learn to walk, that is a controlled mental process. It's a very difficult activity to learn, but once you've done it, you can walk around now without having to think about it. You don't have to reflect on the process. It just happens. So it's become automatic. Because it's an automatic process, it's a system one process, but you wouldn't call walking emotional. So that's where I think also that's been a bit unhelpful for people. Just say, oh yeah, system one, that's all about and only about emotion, and system two is only about rational stuff. You ask people to explain how they feel about something, that engages reflective mental processes. Those are system two processes, but they're talking about feelings. So you can't divorce the two.
Yeah, absolutely. To be honest, this is a slight step away, but the point about the being non-binary, even Binet and Field's wonderful work, the long and short, and everything subsequently with their recent papers, people fall into the trap of treating the choice being long or short, but actually long feeds short and short feeds long. They need each other to coexist.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Again, it's that you can't just pigeonhole them and separate them. It just doesn't. The brain doesn't do that. So it's just impossible to do.
Yeah, and the long does tend to be the more emotional. So I'm sure maybe there are parallels there, actually. So the final part of the interview then, Phil, are our 4 pertinent poses that we put to all of our guests. Number 1 is, what advice would you give to your younger self?
Right. I would actually have chosen a different degree subject. I would have chosen psychology. And nowadays there's an explosion in the number of degrees you can do, both undergraduate and postgraduate qualifications in this whole area of behavioural science, whether it's sort of hard cognitive neuroscience or softer just consumer behaviour. I think that would have been fascinating to do, and I genuinely envy the grads coming through now for getting a better grounding than I had in human behaviour.
Number 2, if you could banish one thing from the industry, what would it be and why?
Well, just to recap, definitely the emotional versus rational. It's unhelpful, it's wrong, and once people understand how this truly works, I think it will help people to become a lot more effective.
Number 3, any books that you would recommend to our listeners other than Decode?
Thank you. Yeah, a couple. I think, as I mentioned briefly before, Lisa Feldman Barrett, How Emotions Are Made, is very interesting. That's one of our sort of go-to books on emotion. You mentioned before about the leaving room for imperfection, and one of I'm a great admirer of Mark Earle's publications, and his recent one, Copy, is a good example of how things evolve and new ideas are created by leaving room for imperfection, but also copying with imperfection. So that one I would certainly recommend. And of course, just for a thumping good read, because it's entertaining as well as weighty and important, is Rory Sutherland's latest one, Alchemy.
We've I think I've said this on a previous episode, but in case that hasn't been heard, I would go further and recommend the audiobook version, simply because Rory narrates it himself.
Ah, perfect.
Because it involves Rory and a microphone, there's a lot more said than's in the book.
Excellent.
Okay, fantastic. So lastly, we always dedicate every episode to someone, and we bestow or hospital pass that honour, depending on your view, to our guest. So would you do the honours?
Yeah, I would dedicate this to the 2 guys who founded DECODE, actually, Dr. Christian Shire and Dr. Dirk Held. Christian is the neuroscientist and Dirk is the psychologist, because they're to blame. They're the guys who completely upset my life and my career and got me to switch and set up a business on my own with no clients in the middle of the last recession, just just because of their their knowledge, their enthusiasm, and how they help me understand the vagaries and the principles of human behaviour.
Well, this show then, I'm not sure whether we've never had there to blame, but Dr. Shah and Dr. Held, you are to blame. So you are. Yeah, this episode is dedicated to you. Fantastic. So as a final call to action for everyone listening, go and buy Decode now, the science behind why we buy. Head over to this episode online via calltoaction.co. We'll share a link to Phil's great book and all of his recommendations from this episode. How else can people get more Phil Barden?
Easily. They can email me. I'm happy to answer questions and have discussions. So my email address is phil@decodemarketing.com. Decode Marketing, all one word. And they could follow me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @PhilBarden, and be happy to follow them back.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Phil. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I've really enjoyed talking.
Likewise, it's been good fun, and thank you for the opportunity to chat.
Oh, you're very welcome. And thank you to everybody listening. Please do feel free to get in touch with the show with everything from guest requests to questions to put to those guests. You can find us easily by looking up Gasp online. You can follow the podcast on Instagram, it's CTA Pod, or simply email the show at hello@calltoaction.co.
I can't get no call to action. I can't get no call to action, but I try, and I try, and I try, and I try.